This is On Shifting Ground. I'm Ray Suarez. In bustling American cities, the challenges of life appear to increase with each passing year. Traffic snarls, scorching heat waves, rapid urban expansion out on the perimeter all contribute to a sense of overcrowding, disorientation. And as cities grew ever more important to international trade, in both the industrialized and developing world, it seems inevitable the future is urban. I grew up in the most hectic city in the country, New York, and my childhood made me a lifelong lover of urban places, of a life where stepping out the front door meant easy access to all the necessities of life. For me, the strongest recommendation for city life was having immediate access to the best the city has to offer, on foot, by train, on two wheels. It's one way to know it's a good place to live, and it makes perfect sense to me that the concept is attractive for so many. What's come to be called the 15-minute city represents an old and fresh paradigm in urban planning. Everyday necessities like work, healthcare, and food conveniently located within a short stroll or bike ride. For many, this innovative concept holds the potential to address many of urbanization's challenges, fostering accessible and manageable cities as populations surge and age, reducing reliance on cars and the burning of fossil fuels. Already gaining traction in Europe, authorities in places like Paris and Oxford are actively utilizing elements of the 15-minute city idea to enhance public accessibility to essential services. But this urban planning theory hasn't been without its critics. A vocal group of online conspiracy theorists alleges a more sinister motive behind the 15-minute city, suggesting it serves as a tool for global elites to constrain and manipulate urban dwellers. And as the world increasingly crowds into denser, more compact cities, these alarmist narratives may have consequences. So let's delve into the 15-minute city, examining both its eccentric conspiracy claims and its feasibility in American cities today. Ray Delahanty joins me now. He's a transportation planner who explains the sometimes arcane science of urban planning to general audiences in his excellent YouTube channel, CityNerd. Ray Delahanty, welcome to On Shifting Ground.
Thank you, Ray.
When you see sitting in traffic gushed about as a defiant declaration of freedom, when people sitting in a drive-through fast food line become the rebels of Braveheart or Red Dawn, you know you've fallen down the rabbit hole, but were you a little surprised?
I'm a little surprised just because it's such a kind of obscure urban planning concept to rally a conspiracy theory around. This idea of 15-minute cities or 20-minute neighborhoods or whatever you want to call it has been around for quite a while, but something about what happened in Paris and then later in Oxford, England, crystallized it for a certain type of person and made it something that became a defined enemy, which they considered to be opposing their freedom somehow.
I think one of the weird flexes of the moment is if you take anything and add the World Economic Forum in there, it immediately becomes a sinister harbinger of one world government. Did you realize what was happening when it was happening?
Yeah, I think I did a little bit. I kind of noticed that sort of stuff bubbling up in the conversations that I follow. And bodies like the World Economic Forum probably don't do themselves huge favors by calling things the Great Reset. That's probably a little ominous sounding to a certain type of person. But again, we're talking about urban planning concepts that are kind of vanilla, honestly. I mean, the idea of building our cities so that it's not difficult to walk and accomplish your daily needs, whether it's shopping or dining or going to the doctor. That's not a new idea. We've always tried to design cities that way, and most of our oldest cities are already designed that way. So there's really nothing new there except for the way it's labeled and branded.
In your series, CityNerd, you routinely bust American travelers by noting where it is they like to go for enjoyment, relaxation, the places they take pictures of and show people when they get home. What are those places and what do they have in common?
Whether it's traveling to Europe in particular and going to cities that far predate the advent of the automobile, we're talking about cities that have dense historic centers with narrow streets that are either difficult or impossible to drive your car on. Those are places Americans love to go and spend time and really feel like they're in a charming, quaint, walkable place. But, when they go back home, people don't expect to have them for whatever reason in their everyday lives.
That's the interesting hinge point to this conversation for me. These places are enjoyed. I mean, Faneuil Hall in Boston, Independence Mall in Philadelphia, places where people pool up, where streets are narrow and walkable and everything's within reach. We love those places as places to relax, yet we assume when we go home and show people our pictures that we can't have that.
That's right. I'm not sure why there is that assumption. I guess it's a little bit of a Stockholm syndrome, right? A lot of Americans are captive in suburban neighborhoods or even urban neighborhoods where you really do have to rely on a personal automobile to take care of your daily needs. And you just kind of accept that that's the way it's going to be. And you don't look for opportunities to improve that situation.
It's almost as if the car is a security blanket. We know those real town centers, built at real human scale, exist somewhere, but we'll take this Potemkin version of it as long as we can have 100-acre parking lot behind it and know that our 2.5 tons of glass and steel and rubber and computer chips is waiting for us when we're done. Do we give up too easily?
Yeah, I think so. A lot of this is difficult political stuff. People do like the kind of autonomy that a car gives them. But once you prioritize that, once you value that so highly that it prevents you from electing the kinds of political leaders who can help retrofit our cities or emphasize the elements that help make cities more walkable and livable in small area increments, like a 15-minute city. It's just tough to get those things done if you're really wedded to the idea of being able to drive everywhere and seeing that as your sort of freedom.
You mentioned the word retrofit, and I'm glad you did. Are there things that even places that are heavily auto-dependent can do to start looking inward?
This is something that urban planners do as a matter of course. We create comprehensive plans for our cities and our suburbs that often include the idea that you can't necessarily make an entire American suburb a 15-minute city overnight, but you can take particular nodes and you can densify certain nodes so that there's more housing in certain locations that's supportive of more services, more retail, more dining. So in that way, I would say, yes, there is hope, not for a citywide 15-minute approach, but to at least have those kinds of opportunities at more dense nodes within a city.
There, if you choose to have it, I guess. I mean, one of the really, let's say, ugly electric charges that runs through the conspiracy theory around 15-minute cities is that it involves coercion, that it involves taking away consumer choice, so that if you say, well, look, I like driving everywhere, there won't be places where you can you can still do that, and vice versa. We're all going to be herded into places where we must walk and bike, like 1960s Chinese cities or something. I wonder if any of the plans that you've seen involve either using the market or using government muscle in a way that some people might see as coercive.
The general idea is really the opposite of coercive. It is about providing more choices for people to get around and take care of their daily needs. But, I think I mentioned Oxford, England before. That's a good example of a place where the way they've implemented, and I don't even want to say it's a 15-minute city concept because they were really approaching it a different way, but it could be considered a bit coercive if you split your city up into multiple of what you call districts, which has kind of a Hunger Games sound to it, I think. And you give people a certain number of credits for trips between district by car. And if they go over that amount of credits, then they have to start paying hefty fines. I can see how that could be seen as coercive. I mean, you still have choices. In cities like that, you have good transit options in a place like Oxford, England, that you probably don't have in any kind of similarly sized US city. It is a pretty bikeable, walkable city. So it's not like you don't have a lot of alternatives to driving. But for someone who does really like to drive, or in some cases might have to drive for whatever reason, if there's some sort of disability or what have you. Yeah, I would say that can come off as coercive.
Because one common feature of a lot of the conspiracy theory writing and podcasts and videos is that people are going to be forced into ghettos, and that word is used quite frequently, and they, whoever they are, I mean, usually the World Economic Forum, want to take away our cars. And I don't know how they get there from the sort of unremarkable, even benign things that I've heard said about 15-minute cities, but it gets there eventually, that some sinister force is going to take away your car and deprive you of the right to wait in a 15-minute drive-through for your venti latte.
The phrase I've often heard throughout my planning career is, "You're trying to force me out of my car." And that could be in response to any number of normal planning approaches, whether it's parking pricing or putting in a bike lane and possibly repurposing a travel lane into a bike lane. Oh, you're trying to make it harder for me to drive, i.e., you're trying to force me out of my car. And really, the thing in Oxford, I think, is less about 15-minute cities than it is about trying to figure out ways to deal with traffic congestion and greenhouse gas emissions and take a market approach to solving traffic problems. And so if you think about London or Stockholm or Singapore, places where they have cordon congestion zones, or even what New York is trying to do, that's a little bit more along the lines of what Oxford is trying to accomplish. But again, those types of things are typically met with a response of, yes, you're trying to drag me out of my car kicking and screaming.
Is some of this just the unavoidable, inheritance of history? You're in Lisbon right now. It's a very old city. And any city that was built before the advent of the automobile is likely to have a different idea of scale and how long it should take to get from place to place, and even the distances between important nodes of activity. Isn't that just kind of the way it worked out?
Yeah, a lot of this is cultural. It's the way you grow up. You grow up in a place where if you want to go somewhere, I was in Valencia, Spain, really exploring and doing research and trying to understand cities so I can have a better perspective on US cities when I come back. And one thing I noticed is there's literally grocery stores every few blocks in a place like Valencia, Spain, which is a metro area of about 2 million. That's kind of Las Vegas. That's kind of Portland, Oregon. That's kind of Cincinnati, Ohio, right? But you don't have that density of different kinds of services and opportunities in US cities. So there is really something cultural about that. You grow up being able to walk to the places you need to go. And, not only that, the other cultural piece is respect for people who are walking. I often notice walking around in cities on this side of the Atlantic that people driving are much more deferential to pedestrians. There's just a lot more empathy because you often are one yourself. There aren't probably that many people here who do that much driving. It's a little more difficult because of the narrow streets. It's tough to park. And they do pay more for registration fees and fuel taxes. So there are a lot of factors that go into how driving is perceived differently in a city like Lisbon compared to most U.S. cities.
Never mind cycling. I am whenever I can be, a bicycle commuter, and it's pretty hard to get around a lot of American cities by bicycle, only because the car has been allowed to win every argument. And anything you do to make cycling easier is portrayed as something meant to handicap motorists. The presumption in the conversation is that you are supposed to make driving easy and friction-free and without any delays.
It's really been that way since the advent of the automobile. Even most U.S. cities, I would say, and definitely on the East Coast and often in the Midwest, these are all cities that have downtown cores that predate the automobile. Maybe there were trolleys, maybe there were horse and buggy. So you might have some wider streets than you see often in European cities. But ever since the advent of the automobile and the introduction of jaywalking laws, and you have to cross at a marked crosswalk, and you have to stay on the sidewalk, none of those types of things ever seem to get rolled back. It kind of continues to get worse instead. So it's very difficult to retrofit streets, even in what you might think of as progressive cities like Portland, Oregon, or Minneapolis or Denver. It's very difficult to do those retrofits to create protected areas for people to bike, which is what you really need. Having painted on-street bike lanes is not really going to attract new riders, and it's just not the safest infrastructure, but it is extremely politically difficult, even in progressive cities, to get those kinds of things done.
I meditate on that every time I circle around a truck that's parked in the bike lane. how hard it'll be. Now, in your writing, you've upped the ante. In effect, you see their 15 and raise the stakes to 5. What's a 5-minute city?
Yeah, I made a video about Valencia, Spain, because we're not talking about a city the size of Paris or London or Madrid. We're talking about a city that's really kind of like a mid-sized type American city. And it doesn't have skyscrapers, but it has a lot of 4 to 8 story buildings everywhere. And what happens when you have that, that's what supports the ability of retailers to have lots of locations, and so supermarkets in particular, but all other kinds of services too. Wherever you are, it's very easy to find a post office you can walk to, and people still use the mail, well, especially tourists who are mailing postcards home. It's very easy to find a pharmacy. It's very easy to find a cafe or a restaurant that serves a particular type of dish. It's often within 2 or 3 blocks. And so I started thinking about, why are you even talking about 15-minute cities? Some of these are 5-minute cities already, and not just parts of them. Basically, the entire city is 4 to 8 or maybe even 12 stories. And they have all those things that can support being able to take care of everything you need to take care of in a very narrow radius. And that's not to say that everybody who lives there only walks 2 or 3 blocks from their home. You also have a fantastic bike network and a great transit network, so you can get all over the city very efficiently. To me, it's a more useful definition of freedom than I own a car and I'm going to spend my days competing with all the other car owners for the limited space on the road and the limited parking opportunities wherever I'm going.
With a country that's big, we've got 335 million people, but also aging. Will there be enough people who would affirmatively choose the life that's offered by a 15-minute city, that if you want to live in one, you'll be able to live in one? Do you proceed on the assumption that its day in the sun is coming?
Yeah, I do, and not for any logical reasons, but just because I have to. I have to think that. I have to believe that there are a growing number of people who see the value of having our cities designed so that we have that flexibility, the freedom to be able to choose to live places and afford to be able to live places where we can walk to the places we need to walk to, and that there are very few things that we need to do that would ever require a car, and that would have reliable and frequent enough transit service so that if we did need to go to a longer distance, we could do that. The goal for me is that I don't need to own a car, which I don't. And I even accomplished that in suburban Las Vegas, although it wasn't easy, and I probably won't go back and try to do that again. But I did experiment with that for a year. But my optimism, I think, also comes from, I get the sense that people who watch my channel and who I interact with, they're quite a bit younger than I am. They're in their 20s, they're in their 30s. And I can't quite explain why there are these differences for younger generations, not just because they're young, but I think there's some cultural things that have happened related to the way people have grown up in the last couple of decades and the things they've seen and the things they've experienced, whether it's the financial issues of the late 2000s or any number of other things. I think it's changed the perspective of the younger folks. So I think as we see the demographics roll on, I suspect we might see more political support for the kinds of things we're talking about.
If you are interested in a rolling tutorial of urban form, urban design, how places we live, work, and don't work, subscribe to Ray Delahanty's CityNerd channel on YouTube. Ray Delahanty, thanks a lot for your time.
Well, thank you, Ray.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced by Elise Manukian, Sienna Barnes, Adam Ailey, and Andrew Stelzer. It was mixed and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Sport is our executive producer. Philip Yun is CEO of World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.